Anthropologists are professional outsiders because anthropologists look at their own society just as odd as any other society. Many young people I talk to, both from the mainland, but also some from Hong Kong, are really worried about how they're getting older. I'm 24 years old, what am I going to do? And I tell them, you have no idea what you're going to be doing. Take your time, because I had no idea that I would be a professor of anthropology in Hong Kong. That would be completely amazing to me if you told me when I was 25 years old that this would be what I would be doing now. I didn't take any undergraduate anthropology courses. Instead, when I was 25, I wound up in Japan teaching English, and then I wondered what I should do with this knowledge. And I learned Japanese and was there for close to a decade. Then I realized that I didn't want to be teaching English all my life, so what am I going to do? So I went back to school in my 30s and got a PhD in anthropology because that's how I could use my knowledge of Japan, because I didn't want to live in the US. I really didn't want to be in the US. I wouldn't say that I was desperate, but it was more a matter of a lot of my friends were going into, you know, finance or going into work for this company or that company, and it just seemed really uninteresting. That's not what I wanted to do. And what would be interesting? Just going to some place I'd never been to before. And I must say, I've been very lucky to get into anthropology, because anthropology is a discipline for people who don't quite fit in their own society in some way, because you see the world outside and you study humans in general in this way. I'll never forget first winding up in Japan, and I was 25, and I was teaching all these classes of little Japanese kids. And I didn't speak any Japanese, or very little Japanese. And so what an adventure. Here I am. How the hell do I teach these kids? They're all 6 and 7 years old. What am I supposed to do in here? It was a lot of fun, you know. Clock, television, happy, sad, you know, that's how you have to do it. Very interesting. And that was my life then. And it was strange to go from an Ivy League university in the US to being in this classroom with little kids in Japan. It was a big adventure in life, and I'm really happy I did it. I always felt alienated from American society, but once I'm in Japan, gaijin da. I mean, you're a foreigner. And of course you are, and it seemed a more natural situation to be in somehow. Anthropologists are professional outsiders because anthropologists look at their own society just as odd as any other society. I now teach a class called Humans and Culture, and one piece we read is by an American who wrote this wonderful article about the Nasarima, who are this exotic tribe who have this mouth worship. They go into this special room every night and they carefully do this thing to their teeth. Well, of course, the Nasarima are American backwards. Students don't know that. And so who are these people? Who are these people? They are you. Now, not Hong Kongers, but we all in the modern world brush our teeth. That would seem really weird from an outside perspective. Now, I know for health you need to brush your teeth. I'm not saying don't brush your teeth, but I'm only saying that this is a strange ritual that is not natural. Or going to a doctor, that's not natural, and so on. So that's a way of getting students to think anthropologically, that no society is completely natural. Everything is culturally constructed. And it's important to see that. That's part of critical thinking. That's what you have to do. Well, last week I investigated renting a place here for when I retire. I went home and Yoko wasn't too happy about that, so I think we'll probably live in a more ordinary apartment, and that's true. But I really like this place. Just to give you an example, I was downtown in late 2019 when the protests caused all the MTR and all that to stop. So I needed to spend the night here. And I came to this place at 11. And damn, they made me a great dinner and then I didn't have to pay for it. And I felt, that's really sweet of them. That's really nice. This place feels like home, really. Anthropology consists of trying to understand the entire range of human life in its social aspects. Now, that's extremely broad. So some anthropologists look at overall human cultural evolution from when we're hunter-gatherers up to, the future. But also there's the particular way anthropologists study, which is to talk to individuals, often quite different from yourself, who are completely opposite in their views, to try to understand what they're thinking. And I always try to encourage my students not to study only people they like, but people very, very different from themselves. Now, it's also possible to do, to study something that you like. That's perfectly fine too. Whether it's a lesbian commune or organic farmer, stuff like that, fine. But also study stuff that's very, very different from you, because you can learn so much from it. Chungking mansions, those people are extremely different from me, the Indian merchants there and the African traders, but what's going on in their lives? What are they thinking? And that's wonderful to do. Now, how does anthropology help understand the world as a whole? It certainly makes me curious in an ongoing way. I always was curious, but it makes me even more curious. I'm going to die before too many more decades, or maybe even too many more years, we never know. But I hope that wherever I wind up, I'll still be able to have an internet connection to read the news, because life is really exciting. What's going on? The good and the bad are all really, really, really exciting. The favorite time of my day is reading newspapers. What's happening in the world online, and looking up all kinds of different websites. This is so much fun to do. So it just makes me endlessly curious, and anthropology has enabled me to write about all kinds of different things. The ideal that I stand for, and the ideal that I put forth in that Facebook message, is one of teaching students to think critically. And critical thinking is, the holy mantra of universities. That's what I've always been told here. That's what we should be doing. And what that means to me, and I think generally, is to give a multiplicity of different points of view, evidence, and let students decide for themselves what they want to think. That's key. Now, what does that mean specifically? I taught a class called Culture of Hong Kong last fall, and a little bit of a touchy topic, obviously, in Hong Kong today, because when you deal with culture of Hong Kong, you've got to deal with things like protests. So the question I ask students in the exam is, explain Hong Kong as based in a culture of protest over the last 20 years from multiple perspectives, including the mainland perspective. We need to know how these protests can be looked at. Obviously from protesters' points of view, but also how would the mainland look at it? Now, the way students were to answer the question is, the first 85% of your answer, give different points of view. Give 4 or 5 different points of view, at different angles. Then it's okay if you give your own reasoned conclusion. And a student who didn't give a mainland point of view as well as a Hong Kong point of view got a lower grade. One question I ask in another of my classes is Meanings of Life is, I am paid more than the person who cleans the toilets here. Why? That's a pretty interesting question to ask, and let's look at this from multiple points of view. You could say, well, you have a PhD, yeah, but that shouldn't matter, maybe. On the other hand, her job is less fun than mine, so why should she make, and I know the person who cleans toilets, so I'm calling her by her gender, why should she make less money than I do? Why should she make, probably 10 times less money than I do? Why? What's going on here? Is this just? And then we will argue about this back and forth. This is a part of critical thinking, and this is a way to get students to really think about their society. That's what education is, I think. And as you can tell, I'm really passionate about this. One of the things that I did that I'm most proud of is when the protests were taking place in 2019, I set up various meetings between our undergraduate Hong Kong students and mainland MA students to talk. And they may not agree, they often didn't agree, but nonetheless, if they can talk civilly, that's what's really important about education. You take somebody with different values than you and you talk civilly. This is what education is all about. One thing I remember that made me sad was the extent to which some of my mainland students felt really excluded. They felt like they were the new ethnic minority in Hong Kong, and that's indeed happened. You know, it used to be that the Africans I know back 10 or 15 years ago would feel really isolated in Hong Kong. I don't hear that so much anymore. Instead, it's some of the mainland students, especially if their English isn't so good and they don't speak Cantonese. It's often hard for them. And that's kind of sad to hear. The message I would give all of my students is, look, you cannot ever assign blame for anybody because of the government they happen to live under. Judge people on the basis of their behavior and what they say to you, not on the basis of anything as silly as nationality. That's as silly as racism. Certainly some people felt that the mainland was dominating Hong Kong to a great degree. But again, that is more a governmental aspect than it is people. And you can't criticize people for the actions of their governments. I got in a bit of a problem on an RTHK program, a radio program, a number of months ago, because I mentioned that when I'm in the US, if I am followed by a young black person in a hood, and it's midnight, it's late at night, I will be a little more frightened than if I'm followed by a white person in a suit and tie. And I was accused of being racist. Maybe it was racist, and I apologize because it is racist. On the other hand, statistically, I felt I would be more likely to be robbed by the black guy. Now, the black guest on the program then said, yeah, if I'm followed by a young white guy in a beard, I'm going to be much more afraid than by a black guy in a suit and tie. Yes, he was absolutely right too. So there is this underlying racism that's difficult to get rid of. All I can say is the same idealistic thing I try to say to students, namely that remember, people are people apart from nationality, apart from skin color, apart from gender, apart from any other attribute they happen to be born into. And by the way, discrimination, gender discrimination is obviously just as bad as racial discrimination. These are all forms of discrimination. Just take people as people. So too, the one big form of discrimination is discrimination on the basis of looks. Beauty discrimination. We don't talk much about that, but that is an enormous form of discrimination, and you should treat people the same regardless of how they look. So these are all forms of discrimination, and we shouldn't practice them as humans. Unfortunately, we do, but all we can do is what you're talking about, what I'm talking about, do all we can to counter them. I think we also need to be honest, though, because dishonesty is just as much a form of, is a worse form of racism. I remember, I believe it was Malcolm X, saying something to the effect that at least, maybe it wasn't him, but it was some prominent civil rights leader, saying that at least when Southern whites discriminate against blacks, you can understand it. Northern whites pretend like they don't, but really they do. Really, that's what they feel. That's a more dangerous form of discrimination. So if you do feel this discrimination, yeah, it's important to own up to it and speak it, and then that's a way of helping to overcome it. Whether Hong Kong can survive here, I tell students that, remember, Hong Kong identity has not always been based on things like protest and so on. No, this is simply one more recent form of Hong Kong identity. Lau Siu-kai wrote in the 1980s about Hong Kong identity based on something he called utilitarian familism, which is that Hong Kongers had escaped the chaos in the mainland. Now they wanted to be in Hong Kong, make a living for themselves, and support their families. Then, of course, in the 80s and 90s, you had identity made on cantopop, made on movies, Wong Kar-wai and so on. Jackie Chan was earlier, but that popular culture was a big part of Hong Kong culture. So you did have these different formations of Hong Kong culture. It doesn't have to be based on protest and pursuit of democracy. It can be based on something else. Hong Kong now continues to have considerable strengths. One thing I've often noticed is the strength and quality of NGOs in Hong Kong, which is quite extraordinary. So too, it can be other factors too. Hong Kong design, for example. I don't know, I talked to a jazz musician last year who said, I want to make Hong Kong identity is based in music and jazz. Can that work? Maybe not. Not too many people follow jazz, but there are various possibilities identity can be made in that don't have to be linked simply to a culture of protest. Because the key is not democracy, the key is the willingness to have civil discourse and really speak back and forth. I would prefer democracy, certainly, but that's not the end of the game, I think. It is the ability to be free in one's views and speak them in an informed way. So you were asking about Hong Kong identity before. Maybe Hong Kong identity can continue in Hong Kong. Maybe, though, it will be reborn in the UK or Toronto or someplace like that. Who knows? Because maybe in Hong Kong it can't exist given what's happening to Hong Kong. I don't know. Maybe you'll have two separate forms of identity. We don't know what's going to happen. About Hong Kong, though, I do have some degree of pessimism. It's only a matter of how long. Can we continue another 5 or 10 or 15 years? Very honorable people I know are saying no, and they leave, and for good reason. Still, I'm not as pessimistic as many people are. Maybe I'm just trying to be hopeful. Maybe that's all it is. That's all I can say. I'm hoping that things will continue and that Hong Kong will continue. On the other hand, in daily life, things continue to be as they always are. And so if I don't pay so much attention to the news, the people I meet are the same people often. The students are the same students. The wonderful encounters I have with ordinary Hong Kong people are as wonderful as they ever were. That continues. So maybe that's one reason for my cautious optimism at this point. Again, though, I really don't want to sound like a Pollyanna here, because I'm well aware of the gathering clouds. I'm certainly not denying that, but I'm hopeful that there might be a little bit of sun coming in somewhere. Most Hong Kong students, or anybody listening to Facebook, they don't know that stuff, and they're thinking, why is this anthropology professor, after writing a message, playing such weird music? That's probably what they're thinking. Fine.